good late afternoon. Today, we're really fortunate to have with us on Perspectives a professor from McDaniel College's campus in Budapest, Dr. Gábor Molnár.
Hello.
Who teaches literature every semester for us here in Budapest and has taught many different, very interesting courses. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Dr. Molnár has agreed to speak with us today, or if I might, Gábor has agreed to speak with us today about the psychological benefits of reading. Here we all are in quarantine. We're all facing COVID-19 lockdown, different countries around the world, different languages, of course, different literatures. But we all, one way or another, have some literature at our fingertips. And with that in mind, I wanted to ask you a few questions about why we should be reading during the lockdown. So, well, let's begin. What can you tell us about the psychological benefits of reading?
When the Italian writer Italo Calvino asked himself the question, why read the classics? And the final conclusion that he came up with was because reading the classics is better than not reading the classics. So I guess that would be my short answer. Why not? Since you have so much time on your hand, why not? Why shouldn't you spend it on something useful and edifying? I guess reading is as good an activity as anything else when you're in isolation. But to give you a more detailed or more serious answer, the mental benefits of reading have been studied for a long time. I found articles dating back to the 1930s that deal with the mental health benefits of reading. Of course, this research has a long prehistory and it's not all rosy. You might be interested to know that in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were actually campaigns against too much reading. Some scientists and medical professionals actually believe that reading has serious harmful effects if you overdo it, right? But in the 20th century and the 21st century, it's usually the benefits for mental health that are emphasized. And of course, there's an entire medical field or psychological field called bibliotherapy, which studies the mental health benefits of reading. And based on the few seemingly reliable articles that I found on the subject, there are a number of easily identifiable benefits for reading. One of them, and perhaps the most important one, is that it's a form of mental exercise. So it's if done, the right amount and with the right mindset, it's just as important as physical activity. It keeps the mind fresh. It can even stave off dementia. Apparently, there are some links. Direct links between an interest in reading and mental health, both in children and in the elderly. So I think that's the most important benefit for the individual.
Can I ask though?
Sure.
So indeed that benefit comes anytime you read, right? So just as you note, for the elderly who might fear, like you said, dementia. Mm-hmm. Reading every day is a way to ward that off. But what about during a period of quarantine? What then might be a particular benefit of reading?
Well, if you feel isolated from the world, I think reading can offer you a connection to the world, which is not, of course, oftentimes we think of literary reading as a way of escaping the hustle and bustle of the material world. But I think in times of isolation, it's more a method to connect with the world, even if it's only a mental connection or a psychological connection. But when you read great fiction, or when you read anything for pleasure, and I think that's a key word here. Some research. Maybe we can link some articles to the interview later. One brand of or branch of research really emphasizes the importance of pleasure in reading. So you should read something that you find pleasurable, and when you read for pleasure and something that piques your interest, then you definitely get connected to a part of the world that you may not have access to otherwise. Mm-hmm. And that's I think it's not necessarily true of fiction only. So if you are interested in history, for example, or philosophy or psychology or any other branch, when you read and you're really interested in your reading, then you definitely learn something about the world that is outside.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you might recall that there was an interview with our colleague Luis Murillo.
Yes.
And he was noting that we suffer from lack of social contact during a quarantine, and it affects us mentally in pretty profound ways. Well, what else might you add as far as maybe your own personal experience or not, and the benefits of reading?
Well, just to react to your last comment, maybe I don't know how much this is researched, but I think people who enjoy reading in the first place, I guess if I may use this pronoun, I think we are perhaps better equipped to handle isolation in the first place. Because I think people who are voracious readers or who feel this internal need to read, they are perhaps a little less dependent on social contact in the first place. I remember an essay by the American writer Jonathan Franzen, which deals with this issue. So a lot of people who grow up as readers, later when they form, sometimes they come off as antisocial or introverted when they are kids, and later when they form social connections, then they use their reading as a basis for social connections. They find like-minded people, and of course they like sharing about their reading experiences and so on. So it's when you discuss the mental benefits of reading, or the mental health benefits of reading, sometimes it's a chicken and egg question. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the introverted nature of readers that makes them better able to handle a situation like that, or is it the other way around?
Mm-hmm. And we might also note, forgive me,
sure.
Before the thought escapes me, we might also note that, just as you said, reading can be an element of a social activity, and during quarantine as well as not. There are book clubs online.
Oh, sure.
There are many opportunities between students, between professors, between people who've never met otherwise, to discuss a common reading. And that too ought to be considered something important, I suppose, during the COVID-19 lockdown. But I'm sorry, you were going to add something as well, I think.
No. It's what you're saying is really interesting. Of course, since I'm a teacher, I'm used to discussing books with students all the time. Mm-hmm. So it's my hobby, but it's also my job in a way. So sometimes I don't notice that this is what I'm doing on a weekly basis. But I think if you're a reader and you find yourself isolated, then one way to break the isolation is to find a website or a community that allows you to discuss your favorite readings, and that can be, so you're not only accessing the word mentally, but you can actually form social connections via reading, mm-hmm. via shared interest in reading.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are two other questions I'd really like to ask you before we close our conversation. The first is, are there any particular examples from world literature? And I should note for those who are listening or watching that one of your specializations is in world literature. Are there any particular examples where pandemics or epidemics play an important role that you might want to point to for those who can't get enough of the pandemic we're in right now?
Mm-hmm. well, probably more than I can remember right now, but there are a couple of titles that spring to mind. Perhaps the most famous one is Boccaccio's the Cameron, where the narrative frame is provided by the Great Plague of the mid 14th century that swept through Europe, and the basic frame tale is 10 young people escaping the town of Florence to go to a villa in the countryside and entertain each other with tales. So the epidemic is kind of the backbone of the story. Another one that comes to mind is a 20th century novel by Albert Camus, which is, if I remember correctly, it's called The Plague in the English translation, and it tells the story of an epidemic, which is also kind of a moral allegory, moral political allegory for events in the 20th century. And another one is Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love at the Times of Cholera, right? Where again, it's an important part of the plot. These are the ones that come to mind right now.
Fascinating. One other question, if I might, especially if we consider Hungarian authors, great Hungarian authors, are there any who are well known for quarantining themselves in order to get their writing done?
Hungarian authors. Oh, maybe not themselves, but there's this famous anecdote of the great 19th century novelist Mór Jókai, who was well known all over Europe at the time, and his second wife, who was much younger than he was, and he was a well-established writer at the time, and he made a lot of money writing his novels. So his second wife apparently locked him up for several hours every day in his study, and he wasn't allowed to come out before he wrote the required number of pages. So it wasn't self-isolation, but right. It was a form of isolation.
Right. And now, of course, nowadays, Hungarian school children are reading yokai as part of the curriculum, right? So some of what he perhaps produced in enforced isolation is now in your classes.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your time today, Gábor, and I hope we can do it again before too long, but hopefully not necessarily in quarantine.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Yes.
And thanks again for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. Well, all the best.
To you too.